Hey guys, John here. This patch, I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is that it sounds really cool. It's very emotional pad. The bad news is that it uses a lot of CPU, so keep that in mind if you're using this one. I had to drop it down to poly number 6 and kind of slowly start reducing my unison voices to kind of make sure this all works. But it's very cool and it's very in-depth, so this one is going to be kind of a long one because there's a lot going on with this patch here. So let me serenade you with this Voices of Heaven, and hopefully it doesn't crash my computer. Here we go. All right, we made it. Okay, so let's get to business here. So let's go to the synth section here, and oh man, this one is a lot going on here. So let's turn off all of these effects here. So we are going to be using all three engines, so 1, 2, and the utility engine. And let's turn these off one by one. Utility engine off, utility engine, or engine 2 off, and let's take a look at engine number 1. So before we even get into engine number 1, keep in mind the routing is going to be split. So filter 1 is going to FX Bank A, so these first 3 over here, and then filter number 2 is going to feed to FX Bank B, which is the second, or the second slot, or second, whatever you want to call it, slot with these 3 banks of effects here. So with that being said, engine number 1. So we're using all square waves here. So the master tuning is going to be 0, no change here. Oscillator 1 down 1 octave. Oscillator number 2, no change, except a little bit on the fine tuning at 0.104. And then oscillator number 3 is going to be up 1 octave and slight change on the fine tuning at negative 0.112. So this engine's purpose is mainly that low-end kind of fuzzy warmness, squarey goodness to it. And as you notice, all 3 are having pulse modulation happening. So if we go over to these width here, we can see that, okay, this is LFO1, this is LFO1, this is LFO1 again. So how is this happening? So we go over here to LFO1 and we notice this is free running first thing. So they're always moving. They're not re-triggered by every one of our key presses. And our rate is going to be slow at 0.163. Kind of really gives us that rich pulse width modulation, the PWM sound to it here. Now this first one, the width is going to be all the way to the left at 0.5, and then the modulation's at 1, so it's kind of doing almost a full cycle. It's not going entirely because you can't go all the way to silence in this synth, but it's going to the maximum that this synth can do. For the second oscillator, it's going to be starting at 0.975, which is the maximum, because if it's at 1, it would be silence, right? There's going to be nothing else to hear. And this is going to be negative 1, so it's kind of going backwards as the first one is going forwards. And then number 3 is kind of doing its own kind of thing, right? It's starting at 0.597, and it's getting modulated by 0.25, so it's kind of just has a smaller range to wiggle in. And the volume for the first 2 is going to be at 0, and then the third one, the higher pitched one, the higher octave, is going to be down a little bit by negative 3.97 dB. And with that being said, let's take a look at the envelope here, because that's kind of a big part of this sound here, because we want to have that slow kind of pad thing. So attack 2.88 seconds, decay 5.19 seconds, sustained 0.628, and the release 2.86 seconds, which a lot of this contributes to the high CPU usage, right? And the attack curve had to be changed to negative 1.92, and the decay curve to negative 4. Actually, I think that is the default, actually, negative 4. So yeah, if you should be probably negative 4 there. Okay, so that's kind of the most simplistic part of this patch here. So if that was a lot, take a deep breath and let's tackle engine number 2. So this is going to be sample, and we're kind of going to be doing something we haven't done before here. So we turn this on, and what the heck do we have here? So first thing, this is dropped down by 1 octave or 12 semitones. And this fine over here is getting modulated by LFO number 2. And this one is interesting because this is going to be on a poly keyboard, so this LFO will re-trigger every time we hit a note. But the interesting spot is it's vibrating at 3.87 hertz. So it's kind of like a vibrato, right? Like when someone sings, you hear that vibrato kind of at the tail end of their note. And this is what that's simulating. And over here, we selected fade. So if we kind of select this, kind of move this, we can kind of see this fade in because we want this LFO to change, but we don't want it to change immediately. We kind of want it to fade into this LFO. And take a look at the shape here once we press a note. It kind of starts a little bit soft and then it kind of increases to its maximum amplitude. So those voices are kind of providing that type of vibrato effect there. And then unison, we have 4 voices of unison and they detuned 2.27. And then this is going to filter number 2. So now we're going to get into the crazy parts here. So this is going to be sample, as you can see, but also on granular. So let's run through these settings real quick, and then we're going to talk about what's going on with these samples here. So granular's on. This should be default at 0.5. Density is 30.4 hertz. Size 381 milliseconds. The start 0.264, the pitch 1.144, density 0, direction 50 backwards, 50 forwards, the size 0.128, width 0.5, and the volume 0. And these ones down here where it says random, it might be a little bit hard to see, but these knobs down here are basically just dealing with randomness. Before it had like dice logos, but this just says random now. So these knobs down here deal with the randomness of these grains. So with that being said, what we're doing is actually using 3 different samples. So the first one is going to be the choir oo C3. The second one on B is ah C4. And then the third one is C angelic. So basically we have 3 different kind of vocal sounds. They can all be found in this menu. I think it's down here, vocal, and then choir, the oohs and ahs. You can kind of find them all in that folder over there. Now, an important part is this start button here is going to be modulated by random number 1. So what that means to us is we don't want these samples to be re-triggered at the same spot every single time because that's kind of boring. We want differences. We want something unique every key press. So we go to this random, and random 1 sample and hold, sampled from white noise, and the re-trigger source is the poly keyboard. So every time we hit a note, you can see we get a new value here, and each new value is tied to the start position of these waveforms. So we hit some notes, and if you look in here, we're actually triggering all of these 3 different samples, which is pretty wild, which also contributes to the high CPU load. But it sounds pretty cool once everything's in and all the effects. So that's kind of the downside. You can make something sound really cool, but then you're going to be taxing your CPU. So that's kind of the only downside of that. So one thing I do want to mention here on this angelic, the tail end was kind of a lot. So you can always go into edit, and I kind of dragged this white flag here a little bit to the left to kind of only use what I kind of wanted to only really get the meat, because it's not going to be playing through the whole sample. So it doesn't really matter if it cuts off because we're using granular synthesis as opposed to just playing a sample. We're using all these little grains here, as you can see. And every new note, it starts on a different spot like we just saw, which is kind of cool. So what else do we need to talk about? Oh, yes. So over here into map, this is going to be important here. This is going to be on random right here. So A, B, and C. So it's going to be a random choice, whichever one gets picked. So even more randomness into these ahs, angelic kind of sounds. So mysterious sounding, right? So aside from that, the kind of concept that I kind of did want to talk about is I kind of went back and forth with the coarse tuning here. I'm like, should this be down 1 octave? Should it be at the regular pitch? What are we going to kind of do here? So for sample A, this is going to be C3, and then B is going to be C4. So that's up 1 octave. So it's kind of covering almost already a range of C3 and C4. And then the third one is angelic. So it's kind of whatever you get for this one. So that was that thought process behind that. And then at the very top end, it almost sounds a little bit like strings. And then we add the engine number 1 into that. And it kind of starts coming together. Now keep in mind, if you want a little bit more of that, that squareness, this engine number 1, You can always change the engine volume over here. You can kind of maybe bring this up a little bit, but I chose to kind of have the vocal sounds a little bit more on top. So this one's 8.05 dB, whereas analog number 1 is going to be negative 7.76. So that's the difference there for the output of the engines. So hopefully that is covered there. Now let's take a look at the utility engine. Let's turn this bad boy on. And all we're really doing is we're having this low end sine wave down 1 octave and going direct out just to give a little bit of low end, kind of a little bit more support to the whole patch there. It's kind of like a subtle bass just kind of there ringing, kind of making everything a little bit more warm. Seems like it adds a nice little touch there. So these filters here are going to be Jupiter 8 for the first one, because I think it's kind of a nice soft one for this square pulse wave, pulse width modulation engine to go through. It's kind of nice and subtle for that at a low pass 12. And then filter number 2 is going to be the multi-mode for the vocals here. And we're kind of cutting off at about 135, which is kind of typical for a lot of vocals to cut off around that range depending on the singer. So I kind of wanted to re-emulate something like that and kind of cut off a lot of the low end because we have the first engine and then we have the sub going on. So we really don't want the vocal low end stuff there really interfering with that sound. And then the resonance is 0.352 to kind of accentuate that curve there on a high pass 12. So, all right, that covers the sound generation. Take another deep breath and let's go to the effects because there's kind of a lot going here. We're using every single effect bank. So as before, we have FX A and B. So let's turn off utility engine 1, or I guess that's the only one, and then engine number 2. So now we're really only going to be hearing the first engine running through these 3 modules here. Okay, so what we have here, first we have this chorus Juno 6. So this is dry. And then here's Juno 6. I really love how that sounds there. So this rate is going to be 0.400, the depth 4.44, and phase 180. So basically default, once you load up this this module, it sounds just kind of really good out of the box. Didn't really see a reason to change it. However, keep in mind that the chorus and the delay and then the reverbs and all that stuff are going to be tied to this effects knob down here. As you can see, this macro little blue light up here. So with one macro, you can turn all the effects on and off if you want to do that. Or maybe reduce them a little bit. Up to you. Next up, we have the multiband. And this is more so to balance all these different bands, kind of make sure what you want to accentuate. It's got the nice low end here, and the mids are kind of a little bit more tucked down, a little bit more compressed, and the highs are just a little bit below that. Because the highs, while they sound cool, would interfere with the vocal sounds with the whole patch going on, so that's why these are a little bit more tucked down. Moving on from there, we have a delay, and this time is going to be 1/8, fine 0, feedback 0.352, stereo spread 0.040, high pass 20 hertz, low pass to 20K. And again, this is tied to the macro number 1, which is labeled FX, intuitively. So that is the first engine right there. Let's take a look at number 2 and turn on the utility engine for that low end. But it doesn't really matter because this one is going direct out. So it's really engine number 2 that's going to FX Bank B. So let's turn this one on here. We're greeted with a delay, a reverb, and a shimmer. And you might think, what? We have 2 reverbs? And yes, it's actually kind of interesting how this works out. So the first one is delay. So that's just dry, and here's our delay here. Makes it a little bit larger than live. 1/8 for the time, fine 0, feedback 0.352, stereo spread 0.040, high pass 20 hertz, and the low pass frequency 4.2K. And the dry wet's at about 25% with the FX knob all the way to the top. So next we go into a reverb. So we want these delays to happen and then get reverberated. And then the reverb should go into the shimmer. So the reverb is getting shimmerized, or however you want to say that. So that's kind of a cool concept there. So the dry wet for the reverb is going to be at 0.25, pre-delay 30 milliseconds, size 1.29, decay 0.534, stereo width 0.5, high pass 200, low pass 15K, damping 0.6. Now you might have noticed that this pre-delay is a little bit higher, and that's because I wanted to have those vocals really kind of take the stage first for 30 milliseconds, and then the reverb starts to come in after that. Then it gets fed into this shimmer over here. So we turn this on, and the shimmer's value is going to be 0.40, pitch shift 1 octave up, feedback 0.604, size 58%, modulation 1, high pass 200, low pass 11K, or almost 12K, about 11,834, ducking 0.292, and then stereo width 1. And then don't worry about this reverb down here, that's just default here, and nothing is getting sent to it, so it is off. And that's pretty much this patch in a nutshell. It's kind of a lot going on, but with everything together, it sounds pretty cool. Let's see, we have all our effects on here and ready to go. It's fun to play that for a while, but like I said, it is very CPU heavy, so even Poly 6 might be a lot, so you might need to crank that down if this is kind of choking your CPU, or maybe dial down a little bit of the grains or the unison voices to kind of help out with that, or reverb tails, stuff like that. So with that being said, if you'd like to get this patch for free, it is available in the video description below, so enjoy that and hopefully learn something. We'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.